"You married beneath you," she said, her voice carrying that particular brand of cold certainty that only comes from someone who believes their opinion carries the weight of absolute truth. "My name is Michael Trent. I'm 48 years old, a senior loan officer at Meridian Financial in Atlanta, Georgia, and I just finished writing another check for my mother-in-law's chemotherapy treatments when my wife Sarah came home with those words echoing in her head. I was sitting at our kitchen table, the checkbook still open, calculator beside it showing the running total of what we'd spent on Diane's medical care over the past 8 months. $43,218, not counting the prescription costs, the transportation to and from treatments, or the special dietary supplements her oncologist recommended. Sarah walked through the door looking like she'd been carrying a weight all day, and I knew immediately something had shifted. She sat down across from me, glanced at the checkbook, then looked away. That's when she told me what her mother had said during the drive home from treatment. Apparently, while I was working late to cover the overtime needed to fund her care, Diane had decided to share her thoughts about our 15-year marriage. "You married beneath you," she'd said, as casually as commenting on the weather. Sarah tried to defend me, tried to point out everything I'd been doing, but Diane had just waved her hand dismissively. "He's adequate, I suppose, but you could have done so much better." I closed the checkbook, looked at my wife, and smiled. "I'm glad to help," I said, keeping my voice steady, always happy to support family. Sarah started to apologize, started to explain that her mother was stressed from the treatments, that the medication made her say things she didn't mean. I held up my hand gently. "Don't worry about it. She's going through a lot right now." What Sarah didn't know, what Diane certainly didn't know, was that I'd been preparing for something like this for months. Not the insult specifically, but the general pattern of disrespect that had been building since the diagnosis. See, in my 23 years in mortgage finance, I'd learned that people reveal their true character when they're under pressure. Money pressure, health pressure, family pressure. The mask comes off, and you see who someone really is underneath all the social pleasantries. I'd met Sarah in 2008, right after I'd been promoted to senior loan officer. She was working as a pediatric nurse at Children's Healthcare, and we met at a coffee shop near the hospital where she'd go between shifts. Diane had been polite enough during our courtship, even seemed to approve when I bought Sarah an engagement ring that was probably more expensive than I should have afforded at the time. But there were always little comments, little observations about my background, my family, my education. My father had been a maintenance supervisor at a paper mill in Macon. My mother worked part-time at a grocery store and raised 3 kids. I put myself through Georgia State University working nights at a shipping company, graduated with a business degree, and exactly $400 in my checking account. I started at Meridian as a junior underwriter, worked my way up through every department, learned the business from the ground up. By the time I married Sarah, I was already handling complex commercial loans and had built a reputation for understanding the intricacies of distressed properties and workout situations. Diane, on the other hand, came from what she liked to call good family. Her father had been a mid-level executive at Coca-Cola back when that meant something in Atlanta society. She'd married a social worker who'd inherited a modest trust fund, enough to buy a house in Virginia Highland back when that neighborhood was still affordable. She'd worked as a social worker herself, but always talked about it like she was doing charity work rather than earning a living. When her husband died 6 years ago, she'd inherited the house free and clear, along with enough life insurance to live comfortably if she managed it properly. The problem was, Diane had never learned to manage money. She spent like someone who expected it to always be there, who'd never had to worry about making hard choices between what you want and what you can afford. By the time the cancer diagnosis came, she was already behind on property taxes, behind on maintenance that should have been done years ago, and living on credit cards to maintain the lifestyle she felt she deserved. That's when Sarah and I stepped in. Sarah felt obligated, felt guilty about her mother facing cancer alone. I understood that. When someone you love is hurting, you help. It's not complicated. So I quietly restructured some of our investments, postponed the kitchen renovation we'd been planning, and started writing checks. Sarah's mother needed treatment. She was going to get treatment. End of discussion. But while I was writing those checks, While I was working extra hours and taking on weekend consulting projects to cover the costs, Diane was apparently taking inventory of my shortcomings. I wasn't cultured enough. I didn't appreciate the right things. I came from the wrong kind of family. Sarah had settled, apparently, when she could have married someone from a better background, someone who would have fit more comfortably into Diane's vision of what her daughter's life should look like. The morning after Sarah told me about her mother's comment, I made a phone call to Jerry Caldwell at the Fulton County Tax Office. Jerry and I had worked together on several distressed property deals over the years, and he'd always been straight with me about how the system worked. I asked him to pull up Diane's property record, just to satisfy my curiosity about something. What I found was interesting. Diane owed $8,400 in back property taxes. The house had been in tax default for 14 months, and a tax lien sale was scheduled for the following month. In Georgia, when property taxes go unpaid, the county can sell a tax lien to recover the debt. Whoever buys the lien pays the back taxes and gets a legal claim against the property. If the owner doesn't pay back the lien holder within 12 months, the lien holder can foreclose and take ownership of the property. Diane's house, the same house she'd inherited free and clear, the house she was so proud of in her good neighborhood, was about to be sold for $8,400 in back taxes. And she had no idea it was happening. I spent the rest of that week doing research, property records, comparable sales, neighborhood trends, mortgage history. The house was worth approximately $320,000 in the current market. It needed about $40,000 in deferred maintenance, but it was solid, well located, and in a neighborhood that had been appreciating steadily for the past 5 years. The tax lien sale was scheduled for the first Tuesday of the following month. I marked it on my calendar, but I didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I made several more phone calls to an attorney who specialized in real estate law, to a private investor I'd worked with on distressed property deals, to the title company I used for most of my client transactions. I wanted to understand every angle, every possible scenario, every potential complication. What I discovered was that Diane's situation was worse than just the tax lien. She'd also taken out a small home equity loan 2 years ago that she'd been struggling to pay. The balance was only $22,000, but she was 3 months behind on payments. The lender hadn't started foreclosure proceedings yet, but they would soon. She was facing potential loss of the property from 2 different directions, and she was completely unaware of either threat. In my experience with distressed property workouts, this kind of dual jeopardy situation creates what we call a cascading default scenario. The tax lien takes priority over almost any other claim against the property, which means even if she somehow managed to catch up the home equity payments, losing the tax lien foreclosure would wipe out her equity position entirely. Most homeowners don't understand the priority hierarchy of liens and mortgages. They think all debts are equal. But in real estate law, tax liens are senior to everything except specific mechanics liens filed before the tax default. I'd seen dozens of cases where property owners lost everything because they focused on the wrong debt first. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Diane was critiquing my adequacy as a husband for her daughter, she was about to lose the primary symbol of her social status through her own financial mismanagement. The house that represented everything she thought made her superior to people like me was slipping away from her because she couldn't be bothered to handle basic responsibilities like paying taxes. I started working later, taking on more consulting projects, pushing harder to build up our cash reserves. Sarah noticed and asked if everything was okay. I told her I was just trying to stay ahead of her mother's medical expenses, which was true. I was also preparing for an opportunity that might never come again. 3 weeks later, I was sitting in the Fulton County Courthouse at 9:47 a.m. when they called Diane's property for the tax lien auction. There were about 20 investors in the room, most of them looking for properties they could flip quickly or rent out. When they announced the address, I recognized 2 other investors who specialized in that area of town. The bidding started at the amount of back taxes owed, $8,400. I waited, let the others bid it up a little. When it reached $12,000, I raised my hand and bid $15,000. One of the other investors looked at me, recognized me from previous auctions, and nodded. He knew I wasn't playing games. The auctioneer called for additional bids, got none, and brought down the gavel. I now owned a tax lien against Diane's house, but I wasn't done. The same day, I called Marcus Webb, the private investor I'd been talking to. Marcus specialized in purchasing distressed mortgages from banks that wanted to clean up their portfolios without going through lengthy foreclosure processes. These portfolio cleanups happen more often than people realize. Banks would rather sell a troubled loan for 60 or 70 cents on the dollar than spend months dealing with legal proceedings, property maintenance, and market risk. I explained Diane's situation with her home equity loan, and Marcus made some calls to his contacts at smaller regional lenders. Within 48 hours, he'd negotiated the purchase of Diane's loan from the original lender for 62 cents on the dollar. The lender was happy to get $13,640 for a loan that was heading toward default, and Marcus now owned the full $22,000 debt secured by the property. Now Marcus owned the mortgage, and I owned the tax lien. We controlled Diane's property from two different legal angles. We agreed that Marcus would initiate foreclosure proceedings on the mortgage while I processed the tax lien foreclosure. Whichever action completed first would take ownership, and we'd work out the financial details afterward. In reality, we were coordinating the timing so that everything would happen simultaneously, giving Diane no time to react or find alternative solutions. On Thursday morning, exactly 3 days after Sarah had told me about her mother's comment, Diane received 2 certified letters. One from the county notifying her that her tax lien had been sold and that she had until the following Tuesday to pay the full amount plus interest and fees to avoid foreclosure. The other from Marcus's attorney notifying her that foreclosure proceedings were beginning on her home equity loan and that she had 30 days to bring the account current or face loss of the property. Sarah's phone rang at 10:15 a.m. Diane was screaming, crying, demanding to know what was happening, insisting there had to be some mistake. She'd been paying her taxes, she insisted. There was no way her house could be in foreclosure. Someone was trying to steal her property. She needed Sarah to come over immediately. I was in a client meeting when Sarah texted me about her mother's crisis. I finished my meeting, returned to my office, and called Jerry Caldwell at the county office. He confirmed that everything was proceeding exactly as it should. The notices had been properly sent, the legal requirements had been met, and the foreclosure timeline was valid. I called Sarah back and told her I'd look into it, that maybe there was some paperwork confusion that could be straightened out. I suggested she stay with her mother for moral support while I tried to figure out what was happening. That evening, I drove to Diane's house with a folder full of documents. Sarah met me at the door, looking exhausted. Her mother was in the living room, surrounded by papers, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd seen her since the cancer diagnosis started. "Michael," Diane said when I walked in, her voice shaking. "Sarah says you might be able to help. Someone's trying to take my house. I don't understand what's happening." I sat down across from her, opened my folder, and spread out the documents on her coffee table. Property tax records showing 14 months of non-payment. Foreclosure notices that had been sent to her address but apparently ignored or misunderstood. The home equity loan statements showing the delinquent payments. "Diane," I said gently, "you haven't paid property taxes on this house since March of last year. The county sent you multiple notices. When you didn't respond, they scheduled a tax lien sale. The lien was sold last Tuesday to recover the back taxes." Her face went white. "But I thought I was paying the taxes. They're supposed to come out of my escrow account." I pointed to the mortgage documents. "You paid off your original mortgage when Robert died. There is no escrow account. The tax bills have been coming directly to you." She stared at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. Sarah was looking back and forth between us, trying to understand how something this serious could have gone unnoticed for so long. "What about the other notice?" Diane asked. "The mortgage thing?" I pulled out the home equity loan documents. "You borrowed $25,000 against the house 2 years ago. You've missed the last 3 payments. The lender sold the loan to a private investor who's initiating foreclosure proceedings." Diane looked at Sarah, then back at me. "Can you fix this? You work with mortgages and loans. There has to be something you can do." I was quiet for a long moment, looking at this woman who'd spent the better part of 2 years making subtle and not so subtle comments about my inadequacy. who just told her daughter that I wasn't good enough for our family, who was now asking me to save her from the consequences of her own poor decisions. I might be able to help, I said finally, but it's complicated. The legal deadlines are very tight, and both actions are already in motion. What I didn't tell her was that I owned the tax lien, that Marcus and I had orchestrated the entire situation, that we'd specifically timed everything to create maximum pressure with minimum options for recovery. What I told her instead was that I'd make some phone calls, see what kind of arrangements might be possible, and get back to her as soon as I could. Over the weekend, I called Marcus to discuss our next steps. The foreclosure timeline gave us about 3 weeks to complete the process. The tax lien gave us until the following Tuesday. We decided to let the tax lien foreclosure proceed, which would give us clear title to the property. Then we'd deal with the home equity loan through negotiation. On Monday, I called Diane and asked her to meet me at my office. She came in looking like she hadn't slept in days, which she probably hadn't. I'd prepared a folder with several documents, including a purchase agreement and a quitclaim deed. I found a solution, I told her, but you're not going to like it. The solution was simple. I would purchase the property from her for $50,000, which would cover the tax lien, the home equity loan, and give her about $15,000 in cash. In exchange, she would sign a quitclaim deed transferring ownership to an LLC I'd set up. She could continue living in the house rent-free for as long as she needed, with the understanding that I would handle all maintenance, taxes, and insurance going forward. $50,000? She said, her voice rising. This house is worth over $300,000. Yes, I said calmly, but you don't have $300,000 to pay off the liens, and if the foreclosures proceed, you'll get nothing. Zero. You'll lose the house completely. Your credit will be destroyed, and you'll still owe money on the home equity loan. She stared at me for a long time. Why would you do this? Why would you help me after what I said to Sarah? I leaned back in my chair, considered my words carefully. Because Sarah loves you, and because family takes care of family, regardless of what they think of each other. She signed the papers. But there was one more document in the folder. One I didn't show her until after she'd signed the quitclaim deed. It was the original tax lien purchase record from Fulton County, showing that I'd been the successful bidder 3 weeks earlier. The document included the bid amount, the legal description of the property, and my signature on the purchaser acknowledgement form. I don't understand, she said, looking at the document, her eyes moving across the legal terminology that probably meant nothing to her. I bought your tax lien the day after you told Sarah that she married beneath her standards, I explained, my voice steady and matter-of-fact. Under Georgia law, purchasing a tax lien gives the buyer the right to foreclose on the property if the debt isn't satisfied within 12 months. I've owned the legal right to take your house for the past 3 weeks. The foreclosure notice you received was from me, through the county's standard legal process. The color drained from her face completely. You did this? I protected my family's interests, I said. You were going to lose this house anyway through your own mismanagement. I made sure that when you lost it, it stayed in the family. She sat there in silence for several minutes, processing what I'd told her. Finally, she looked up at me with something that might have been respect, or might have been fear. The house, it's really yours now? It's owned by a family trust, I said. Sarah and our daughter Emma are the beneficiaries. You can live there as long as you need to, but the property is secure now. The taxes will be paid. The maintenance will be done. Your housing is no longer at risk. That was 6 months ago. Diane finished her chemotherapy treatments in December, and her prognosis is good. She still lives in the house, but the dynamic has shifted completely. She asks permission now before making changes or having work done. She's careful about utility usage, respectful about maintenance requests, grateful for the stability. Sarah initially didn't know what to make of what I'd done. She was angry that I hadn't told her about the tax lien situation, confused about why I'd let her mother suffer through the panic of potential foreclosure. We had several long conversations about boundaries, about protection, about the difference between helping and enabling. But she came around when she realized what could have happened if I hadn't intervened. Diane would have lost the house entirely to strangers. She would have had nowhere to go, no resources to start over, and no family support system capable of housing her long term. Instead, she has security, stability, and the dignity of living in her own home, even though the ownership structure has changed. Emma, our daughter, figured it out on her own. She's 16, smart, and pays attention to family dynamics. A few months after everything settled, she asked me directly if I'd bought her grandmother's house to keep it in the family. When I confirmed it, she just nodded and said, "Good. Grandma needed someone to take care of her, but she also needed to learn that you don't bite the hand that feeds you." The house has appreciated about $30,000 since I took ownership, and I've put another $15,000 into necessary repairs and updates. The family trust now owns an asset worth approximately $365,000, secured against any future financial mismanagement or family disputes. Sarah and Emma will inherit something substantial, something stable, something that can't be lost through poor judgment or temporary setbacks. But the real value isn't financial. It's the shift in family dynamics, the establishment of proper boundaries, the recognition of competence and contribution. Diane still makes the occasional comment about social status or background, but they carry no weight now. Everyone understands the actual structure of power and responsibility in our family. Last month, Sarah's brother came to visit from Denver. He pulled me aside during dinner and said, "I don't know exactly what happened with Mom's house situation, but I want you to know that the family appreciates what you did. She would have been homeless without your help." I just nodded and changed the subject. But the acknowledgement mattered, not because I needed validation, but because it represented a shift in how the family understood my role, my capabilities, my value as a member of their circle. Sometimes people need to learn the hard way that competence matters more than pedigree, that reliability trumps social background, that the person they dismiss as adequate might be the only thing standing between them and genuine disaster. I didn't set out to teach Diane that lesson, but I wasn't sorry she learned it. The morning after I bought her house, I was sitting at the same kitchen table where this whole story started, writing another check for her cancer treatments. Sarah came down for coffee and sat across from me, just like she had that first day. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not defending you better, for letting her talk about you that way, for not seeing how much you were sacrificing to help her." I closed the checkbook and looked at my wife. "You don't owe me anything. Family is complicated. People say things when they're scared or hurt that they don't necessarily mean." "But she did mean it," Sarah said. "She really believed I married beneath me." I smiled, the same calm smile I'd given her that first day. "Maybe I did marry above my station, but that just means I've been working harder to deserve what I have. 6 months later, I'm still working hard to deserve what I have. The difference is that now everyone in the family understands exactly what that means and exactly what it's worth. Sometimes the best response to being undervalued is simply to demonstrate your value in ways that can't be ignored or dismissed. Diane learned that the man she thought was beneath her daughter's standards was actually the only person in the family with the competence and resources to protect her when she needed it most. She learned that social background means nothing when you're facing foreclosure, and that the quiet, adequate man writing checks for her survival was worth more than all the cultured conversation and family connections she'd been so proud of. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to let the natural consequences of her choices play out, while making sure my family was protected in the process. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.